Welcome to The Debate, our source material today. It offers this really profound framework for understanding human potential. It's all centered on the idea of Eshraf-i Makhlukat. Humanity is the most honored of creation. And from that flows the ultimate goal, which is to establish the Yurek Devleti, or the state of the heart.
Which is a state of internal moral governance, but it's completely contingent on achieving what the text calls ahsanei takvim, that perfect golden balance of the complete human being.
Exactly. And the material argues quite forcefully that a pervasive modern crisis has just fundamentally shattered this balance. The result is that individuals become fragmented. They fall into one of three unproductive roles, three kinds of victims, as the text puts it.
That fragmentation is really the catastrophe we need to examine. Because when we fail to hold that golden balance between thought, feeling, and action, the triad of kafa, yudik, belek, head, heart, and hand, we become something profoundly diminished. This spiritual imbalance, what the material calls manevi birulum, a spiritual death, is seen as far more severe than physical death.
Right, because it undermines the entire purpose of creation. So, that leads us to our central question today. Which dimension of this imbalance, the intellectual, the spiritual, or the activist, presents the most fundamental, the most difficult obstacle to achieving that internal harmony, that Yurek Devleti? For me, I maintain that the foundational flaw lies in the failure to achieve genuine, integrated intellectual clarity and wisdom, the ilim and hikmet. This failure is best characterized by the Kitab Qurbani, the book Victim.
And see, that's where my analysis diverges a bit. When we consider the hierarchy of importance here, while that intellectual fragmentation is, without a doubt, dangerous, I believe the corruption and neglect of the spiritual core, the Irfan and the Qalb, which is represented by the Tesbih Qurbani, the Rosary Victim, that constitutes the most profound and challenging obstacle. Because if the foundation of the heart is compromised, the entire structure, no matter how intellectually sophisticated, just collapses.
Okay, well, let's detail the nature of this intellectual collapse. The core challenge, as I see it, is the fragmentation of thought, where knowledge, the ilm, it just remains inert. It fails to translate into lived experience or beneficial action, the amal. And this leads directly to a kind of philosophical and existential paralysis. The source material is unsparing in its critique of the book Victim. It describes those who treat reading as consumption, a meta to be consumed and archived, rather than the fuel for active production. This results in fikri kabazlik, a debilitating intellectual constipation.
That description of the book Victim is very precise, I'll grant you that. But I think it describes a symptom, not the root disease. We have to remember that the heart, the qalb, is described as something more than just an emotional center. It's the body's nuclear Guchmerk, its nuclear power center. It is the moral and spiritual command center. So if this core is compromised, if it's turned hard like a stone or rendered inert or actively occupied by worldly desires, then no amount of external knowledge can successfully guide or redeem the individual. The intellect, the kafa, it can only process what the qalb directs it to value.
But the intellectual framework is what gives direction to value in the first place. The intellectual failure prevents the individual from ever reaching genuine wisdom, hikmet. And the material defines hikmet as this ability to synthesize Allah's written revelation, the Wahi, with the revelation we find in the universe, in humanity, and in unfolding events, the Hadisat. So without this synthetic, holistic thinking, this hikmet, the answers to our most fundamental questions, who am I, why do I exist, where am I going, they remain totally incomplete.
I understand the necessity of that synthesis, I do. But who performs the synthesis? It's the heart. If the qalb is not pure, its synthesis will be distorted regardless of how clear the inputs are. The problem with prioritizing the intellectual framework is that a perfectly constructed conceptual fortress, if it's built on a rotten spiritual foundation, will still crumble in the face of temptation or crisis.
How so?
Because the Tesbih Qurbani embodies those who, they possess the knowledge of the spiritual path, but they prioritize internal,
detached devotion to the point that it becomes an uyuşturucu, an anesthetic that numbs them to the painful, active demands of life and the external struggle. They willingly choose the passivity of being a corpse in the washer's hand, gasal elinde meyit, refusing to engage in life's necessary struggle, the büyük jihad. This is a conscious spiritual failure. And the material reminds us the ultimate measure of success is the selim kalp, the sound heart, on the day of judgment. If the heart, the very seat of faith of Iman, is not crying, aching, and loving, inlenian, sizlamayan, savemayan, it signifies a spiritual death that renders the intellect completely impotent.
I agree on the severity of that outcome, of course. Yet I still maintain the root issue lies elsewhere. It's in the starting sequence.
Yürek devlade requires the heart to be cleansed, to undergo that necessary rejection, la ilaha, of all idols, before the new integrated order can be established, ilallah. This cleansing is a spiritual prerequisite. It's not an intellectual exercise. If the heart remains a zindan, a prison, or a mezarlik, a graveyard filled with the remnants of ego, any theoretical structure built on it will collapse under duress. The rosary victim fails this essential internal purging, and the result is complacency, a state often called sweet water Islamism, tatlı su Islam chaluji.
That argument is persuasive, but it relies on the premise that the heart can be reliably cleansed without the correct intellectual map guiding the whole process. I mean, the process of cleansing itself requires clarity. The three types of victims emerge precisely from a breakdown of the Altın Denge, that golden balance. And the greatest threat to monotheism isn't outright denial, it's a çarpık tawhid anlayışı, a crooked or incomplete understanding of tawhid.
And what does that incomplete understanding look like in practice?
It means focusing on one aspect of the faith, say ritualistic cleansing, while completely neglecting others, like morality or social justice, which were central even in the early Meccan period. If the core concept of God's oneness and its demands on the human being is flawed, then the heart is being cleansed according to a wrong blueprint. The book victim has conceptually failed before the spiritual practice can even begin correctly, because they define purity or devotion too narrowly. You just can't successfully establish the moral governance of the Yürek Devleti if you fundamentally misunderstand what that governance requires.
So we're really debating priority here, the map versus the engine. I'm arguing the corrupted engine, the heart, makes the map totally unusable.
And I'm arguing that an incorrect map ensures the engine drives us to destruction, regardless of its purity. And, what's more, this intellectual failure has a direct impact on the external world. The intellectual victim often lives life in books rather than among people. Their practical life knowledge, their hayat bilgezi, is critically weak. And as a result, their attempts to engage externally are often inaccurate, isabetsiz davranır. They lack precision or wisdom. This theoretical paralysis completely hinders the necessary external struggle, the jihad. Knowledge consumption without action is the very definition of unproductive intellectual output, and it fails to translate into the balanced life of taqwa.
I acknowledge that. That intellectual paralysis does create an immense societal vacuum. But we have to acknowledge that the hardened heart is the fundamental reason that external corruption persists. The external systems of the world, the media, the education systems, the economic structures, these are sophisticated forces, and they are aimed specifically at disabling faith. They target the qalb. If the heart is ishgal ulumusht, if it's occupied by the love of the world, then the physical body and the mind become enslaved to external forces like money, status, or technology.
Which is the very essence of the crisis.
Precisely. And this occupation reverses the human role as the master, the efendicy of creation, and it turns us into its servant. An occupied heart means the individual will eventually sell their faith for transient worldly possessions, and that undermines all revolutionary or corrective efforts, regardless of how strong their intellectual arguments are. The threat posed by the Tesbih Qurbani isn't just spiritual laxity. It's the institutionalized lethargy that allows evil systems to flourish unchallenged because the command center has opted out of the war.
But if the intellectual failure provides the theological justification for that very lethargy, doesn't that place the conceptual error at the primary starting point? Let's consider the third dimension of imbalance for a moment, the bilic, or action. The material highlights the sila korban, the weapon victim, the activist who acts without sufficient thought or spiritual grounding. This action-oriented victim is characterized by passion and courage, but lacks calculation, preparation, and integrated wisdom.
I agree that the action victim is a crucial third point in this failure triangle. The overly zealous activist and the spiritual escapist, the tasbih korbane, they do share a common root, the neglect of integrated wisdom and balance. However, the spiritual failure is the most insidious because it means the very engine, the capacity for genuine sevgi, for love, is broken. The material explicitly states that love is the varlik sorsen in javaba, the answer to the existence question. If the heart turns hard, we lose the capacity for this transformative love, which is the required output of the Yurek Devleti.
See, I'm not convinced that spiritual purity, when it's divorced from intellectual rigor, guarantees correct action or love. The problem with focusing solely on the purity of the heart is that it risks replicating the exact same mistake the victims make. Fragmentation. The material explicitly warns that the true danger is that each victim elevates a part of the truth, the kapha, Yurek, or bilic, and treats it as the whole truth.
And how does the intellectual victim facilitate this fragmentation?
By providing the flawed conceptual architecture, when we hold an incomplete intellectual model of the balanced human being, the asani takvim, we then become able to karolea biliarus, to slander other essential parts of the whole. It justifies why we only need to read, or only need to pray, or only need to fight. The book victim constructs a world where theoretical knowledge is sufficient, the spiritual core then insulated from the real demands of Amel. This intellectual error is what allows for this destructive, incomplete perception of truth to take hold across all three victim types. It provides the rationale for the imbalance itself.
But the material also provides countless examples where sincere spiritual effort and repentance correct an intellectual deficiency. We are debating a crisis of being, not merely a crisis of knowing. The culp is the single most important asset, the organ upon which all salvation hinges, because it's the place of Iman. The spiritual enemy knows this, which is why they target this center. If the heart turns hard and ceases to be that nuclear guch merkaze, the entire human system just collapses into manevi birsafaliyat, spiritual destitution. An occupied heart cannot liberate itself, let alone anything external. The internal war of the heart must be won first.
My point remains that winning that internal war requires knowing what you are fighting for and what weapons are required, a framework provided by integrated knowledge, Elam and Hikmet. Without the right intellectual framework, that holistic map, one simply cannot know how to cleanse the heart correctly or what balanced action even entails. The intellectual failure leads directly to the conceptual fragmentation that provides the blueprint for all three victim types.
And I insist that while knowledge gives the structure, the capacity to implement that structure, to experience the transformative power of faith and love resides in the heart. If that center is cold, the most brilliant theological structure will remain an uninhabited museum of ideas.
Ultimately, the source material forces us to recognize the profound and interconnected complexity of our internal collapse. This fragmentation is universal.
Indeed, the path to the Yurek Devlete demands constant, simultaneous attention to these multiple fronts of imbalance. It suggests that the true struggle isn't linear, first thought, then feeling, then action, but a continuous, difficult, lifelong struggle.
An Umrluk bir Itzavash. A struggle of a lifetime, really. That's necessary to integrate the dimensions of thought, feeling, and action into that golden balance. It leaves us to reflect on which of those three fronts we are currently neglecting most profoundly.